We're all Protestants, how the Reformation birthed the modern West. This talk was inspired a little bit. I was in school for forever. Like, I went to school just for more years than I can count. And the best professor that I ever had was a professor at the University of Toronto named Simone Chambers. And she was a political science teacher. And I'd heard she was very good. So I went to sit in on her class. And when you study religions at university, you often find when you go to other departments that they don't take religion seriously enough. They're not comfortable with it. And I don't know, they think it's old and archaic or something, but it completely shapes society. So I was really surprised when this poli-sci prof opened up her class by saying that the most important event in the history of the West is the Protestant Reformation. And I came over time to understand the wisdom of Simone's comment. And so what I want to do with you today is to show how the Reformation shaped at least 5 key elements of our society. And that is how we think about politics, how we think about, obviously, religion, but also how we think about something as banal as ordinary life. Like, what does a life lived well look like? How it's even shaped something like as fundamental as our view of what a person is. And 5th, another big topic that I'm not going to reveal to you now. It's kind of a mystery. We're going to build up to it. And so this presentation is called, I start off by saying we're all Protestants, because my argument is that whether you yourself are a Protestant, a Catholic, a Jew, an atheist, or something else, by virtue of living and growing up in this society, we have all been affected by the Reformation. Perhaps some more than others, but we are all to some degree sort of descendants of the Reformation. Okay, so these are the 5 things we're going to talk about, and we're going to start here with politics. And I will tell you that of the 5, this is the one where we're going to spend the most time. Okay, so this is our friend Martin Luther. And when Luther launches the Reformation in 1517, what he does is he goes beyond critiquing the Pope's corruption. There were a lot of people at this time who realized that the church had become kind of corrupt. There were a lot of people saying we need to clean this place up. And Luther was one of them. But the big thing is that Luther doesn't merely say this Pope is doing bad things. He ends up critiquing the Pope's, the legitimacy of the papacy. He goes from the person to the legitimacy of the whole office. And as a result, he does not suggest a new Pope. He doesn't say, I should be Pope, or we need a new Pope. What he says is the whole idea that a person is a source of authority is a problem. And so what should be the source of authority instead? A text, a book. Now, my friends, what do you call that? What do you call it when the highest authority is not a person, but is some text to which that highest person, even they, must submit? What this is sort of the basis, essentially, for constitutionalism, right? Because what Luther does is he suggests that even the highest authority that there is, the Pope, could be judged. That the standard for that judgment would be provided by a text. That who would do this judgment? You and I. Ordinary people could look at the arguments, assess the evidence, and judge for themselves. And thus, he ends up suggesting that society might be organized in a more egalitarian way that's not dominated by a monarch or a pope. Luther is the founder of the Reformation. The second biggest figure of the Reformation is this guy, John Calvin. Now, I'm going to come back to this screen because I want to show you what Calvin had to say about constitutionalism. But just for a minute, I want to contrast Luther and Calvin. To understand them very simply, Luther is a theologian. Luther's interested in people's personal sort of relationship to God. Calvin is an organizer. And so, as I just said, Luther's addressing how you feel about God, how you address God, your relationship with God. But Calvin will write his Institutes, which is this, set of writings that are big enough to kill a small animal. And they're manuals, really, on the practical, political, and social organization of society. And so when Luther is trying to reform private and interior life, how you think about God, Calvin wants to build a Christian society. Build a society that will create the Christians. And so Calvin will take Luther's ideas, which were really limited to the religious realm, and he will systematize them. And he will apply those ideas to the idea of civil government. He will say that even the civil magistrate has to sort of follow certain rules. And his disciples, because Calvin will start a school, essentially, an academy. And so he ends up having huge influence. And his disciples, groups you might have heard of, like the Puritans, the Huguenots, the Presbyterians, will write seminal texts in the development of Western constitutionalism. If you go look at the development of Western constitutionalism after the Reformation, a lot of them are Calvin's disciples. One of them, John Knox, who founds Presbyterianism, even suggests that people can actually overthrow a political leader. Calvin does not like this idea, but these ideas are taking on a life of their own, right? None of these people, neither Calvin nor Luther were trying to create constitutionalism, but their ideas lead to it. Okay, so under politics, the first impact is it sets a bit of the ground for constitutionalism. Second, Luther does something else. Luther calls for what he calls this a priesthood of all believers, because he not only overthrows the Pope, but to some degree he's saying you don't have to listen to these Catholic priests that everybody looks to as the authority. We'll have a priesthood of all believers. And what we'll turn to is the text. And that means we'll need to be able to read it. And so he translates the Bible into the vernacular, into German. And there are other reformers who will go further than Luther, called the radical reformers or the radical Reformation. And the radical reformers will even have people elect and replace their ministers. What do you call that, of course, when you're electing and replacing the people in charge? Well, as you can see, this is a big boost to the idea of democracy. In fact, just a few years after Luther launches the Reformation and calls into question the Pope, others will call into question the kings and the princes. And this will lead in just 8 years after Luther's Reformation to what is called the Peasants' War, a massive war in Central Europe where the peasants are trying to overthrow the people who are in charge of them. And these peasants put out 12 articles of what they were fighting for. And they don't, back at this time, nobody has this idea, right, of separation in church and state. Like church is everything, permeates everything. And so in their 12 articles, even though they're launching what today maybe we call kind of a political revolution, right, trying to overthrow the princes, the first article is this: every town and village shall be entitled to elect and to dismiss its preacher if he misbehaves. The preacher shall preach the gospel simply, straight, and clear, without any human additions, for it is written that we can only attain God through true faith. Right? Their very first claim is we should be able to elect our preachers and dismiss them. The third point, the third article was, until now, it has been the practice that we have been treated like serfs, which is deplorable since Christ redeemed all of us with his precious blood, both the shepherd and the nobleman with no exceptions. Accordingly, we hereby declare that we are free and want to remain free. Right? If you look at this third point, it is very clear that they are taking the idea of the equality of Christians, which Luther had promoted. Luther wrote tracts called The Freedom of a Christian, and applying it to the political realm. Since we're all, equal under Christ, we're all free and want to remain free. And they launch this war. They lose. But that's the second thing, is this push for democracy, for equality. So constitutionalism and democracy. Third, Luther survives for a couple of reasons. And one of the reasons is that Luther has a tool. People had complained about Catholic excesses for centuries. It's just a lot of them didn't live. But Luther has a new tool, a new toy. And that toy is that Gutenberg has designed, the printing press. And Luther, Simone Chambers, that professor I mentioned, said that he is really the first political campaigner. He uses great slogans like the priesthood of all believers that I just showed you, the freedom of a Christian. And people remember these slogans. They're catchy and they use them in arguments. Sola scriptura, meaning the scripture alone. The scripture alone is in charge, the authority, not the Pope, not the priest. Sola fide, you'll be saved by faith alone, not by acts. And sola gratia, you're saved merely by grace, not by things like the sacraments and things like that. And so the third thing you get with the Reformation is it is the first instance of the West of an effective use of today what we would call mass media. Before, if you had complaints against the church, people could go and maybe hear you. But with the printing press, Luther's slogans can be spread all over Europe. And with these catchy little titles and catchy slogans, he creates a buzz. The Catholic Church is not ready for this. They when they do respond, they respond in Latin that no one can read. They're like Microsoft, or they're like IBM dealing with Microsoft in 1980. Things have changed and they haven't caught up. So that's third, right? So far we've had constitutionalism, democracy, and mass media and political campaigns. The fourth, this one's very interesting. One of Calvin's groups one of the Calvinist branches is the Puritans. And I remember reading this book by this guy, Michael Walzer. He's a famous political thinker. And, I was doing my PhD, and when you're reading books in your PhD, they're all very careful, and here's my argument, and here's my evidence. And Walzer's book, you read the first page, and the guy was like throwing punches. It was such a compelling book, and it was a great book. And what he says in the opening pages of this book that he wrote, The Revolution of the Saints, he writes, competition for power is surely universal in human history. This faction wants power, that faction wants power. That's nothing new. But the idea, he says, of reform, and by reform he means radical ideology, of trying not merely for power, but to remake people, and designing the political systems and organizations to bring about this reform, this change in people, is quite new, he says, with the Puritans. And he argues that it marks the dawn in many ways of modernity. What is this thing, reform, he's talking about? He says the Puritans are not like other factions. They don't just want power. They want to make new men. They want to organize chosen men, not kin, not just this is my cousin and so we're all coming together, chosen men to achieve programmatic ends. And as such, they try to form new bonds and new loyalties. At this time, he says, the bonds, in European society are of blood and of personal affection. But the Puritans will seek new bonds based on shared ideology and zeal to bring it about. And it changes the idea of loyalty. Loyalty had been to one's father, loyalty had been to one's clan and to one's lord and to who your father knew and family relations and stuff like that. But now loyalty instead will be to ideas, to parties, and to states. And surely, from this time forward, if you think of the big movements in the West, they are all about reform. They're like the Puritans, whether it's the Jacobins in the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution in Russia or China, or the fascists in Italy or Germany. These three groups that I put up here do not agree with one another, right? The communists and the fascists hated one another, but they all are modern. They all are about reform. It's not just a faction seeking power. They will want to create communist education and fascist education. They want to remake society. They want new men. Okay, and in order to bring this about, they will have new norms and new methods. Customary ways will be replaced now by a kind of rational evaluation of what are the most effective methods. So it's kind of utilitarian. How do we get where we're going? And Walzer says that politics gets reimagined as a kind of duty or even a work of conscience. And he says it provides the rationale for the diligent modern official who has a duty to serve the state, to perform those kinds of duties. And as a result of the Puritans, Walzer says we get a new politics in the 17th century that we had not seen before. We get the judicial murder, really the execution, rather than the assassination of King Charles I. And he says the trial it's not just a personal attack, it actually examines the office of kingship and finds it illegitimate. We get the creation of a disciplined citizens' army, representative councils and agitators who will lecture even the most ordinary person, instructing them on politics, because you need to reform society. We get the first effort to write a nation's constitution. Notice again here, we're getting constitution, getting tied up with the Reformation. They publicly present a whole list of demands to really redo society, to reorganize things like church, but also civil government, the state, education, the way that aid should be provided for the poor. He goes on. They establish groups to implement these changes. And the groups, again, are not necessarily kin. It's not somebody you grew up with. The groups are chosen on demonstrated ideological commitment rather than those kinship ties. Political journalism emerges. Why? Because of this newly politically interested and awakened public. There's people trying to tell you the way you're supposed to think about all these things, and you're discussing it. And so it's the rise of sort of politics as a more mass phenomenon. An insistent belief in the need for and the possibility of reform. And reform takes on new meaning. Often in human history, reform has been about going back to the purer age. If you study Islam, or if any of you are Muslim, you will know that the golden age in Islam is the rightly guided caliphs. It's the time of the prophet and then the 4 successors after the prophet. And in Europe too, for a long time, you wanted to look back. You wanted to look back to Greece. You wanted to look back to Rome and recapture the glory of when things were once great. But now what we get with reform is not just a return to some past purer time, but a forward-looking thing, a belief in the possibility of creating something that has not previously existed, something wholly new. Part of modernity is the whole idea of progress. Ancient people didn't think so much of progress. They looked back often to Tibet, to some golden age in the past. And Walter argues that there's kind of 4 parallel developments. We get the separation of politics from the household. It's now about parties and ideology rather than kinship. As a result, we get the appearance of formerly free men. You can choose to join this group or not. We get the rational, amoral, and pragmatic consideration of political methods. And we get the rise of large-scale political units. When politics has been built on kinship, it's very much kind of who you know. But when it's built on ideology, it can span a large country. It can even go beyond countries. You can have an international communist movement. Okay, and so to sum up our discussion of politics, the Reformation does a lot to boost the ideas of constitutionalism in the West. I don't mean it invented it whole cloth. There was already the Magna Carta, for example, but it's a big boost to it. It gives a big boost to the ideas of democracy. They don't create democracy. I'm not sure what Luther would have thought about democracy, but they're sowing the seeds of it by making the church democratic. And back then, the church is, your whole world. We get the launch of a mass media campaign, and we get from Walter reform. The idea of politics is ideological work where it requires dedicated men, and you try to educate everyone and reform everyone through education. Okay, so that was politics. As I told you, that would be the longest we would talk about. All right, let's move to our second one, to religion. Luther shifts religion away from sacraments and objects. At the time, the Catholic Church's power was partly that it had these sacraments. And your salvation required that you took communion. Your salvation required that you went to confession. Your salvation required that you be baptized. And Luther didn't like this idea. He said, no, you're not being saved by any kind of actions. It's not some sacrament. It's not a behavior. It's nothing you do. What saves you, he says, instead, is belief. Belief over actions and sacraments. And we in the West think that way. When I tell people that I know something about Hinduism, the first question tends to be, what do they believe? We even have a synonym for the word religion. We sometimes call them faiths. No First Nations community would have described their tradition as a faith. That is a very Christian word, but that's how we think of them today, beliefs and faiths. Second, another source of the church's power was that it had sacred objects. It had statues that sometimes cried. I used to have this. This is a relic of the true cross. In the very center of this, there are 2 little brown lines that make a cross. There are slivers of wood, and they're said to be from the cross that Jesus died on. It had a papal seal on the back and all of that. And people would make pilgrimages to these things. You could go see breast milk of the Virgin Mary. There were even, I think, 10 places you could go see the foreskin that had been taken from the baby Jesus, all sorts of things. And the people who have these things make money because it's pilgrimage and stuff like that. Reformists hate all this stuff. They get rid of the statues in the churches. They smash them. They say there's so many pieces of the true cross that you could use them all to rebuild Noah's Ark. And so Luther says, look, you are not, religion is not about some physical thing. It's not some physical object. Real religion is interior and immaterial. Interior and immaterial. It's a belief inside your heart. And so Luther shifts religion away from sacraments and objects. And in so doing, he emphasizes faith or belief instead. In so doing, he relocates religion to the interior of a person. If religion is I have to go to the sacraments and I need to be baptized and I need to be at Mass, it's kind of a communal thing. It's controlled by the church. And the question is, was I at Mass? But if it's about faith, the questions about my religiosity are really inside me. In so doing, Luther makes religion more individual and personal rather than communal. I don't mean he gets rid of the communal, but real religion is this personal relationship sort of in your heart. Also exacerbating this is that Luther emphasized the Bible and emphasizes reading. And reading, too, is kind of an interior thing, right? You read silently to yourself, or at least that tradition will develop of reading silently to yourself. Again and again, religion is becoming interior and personal, and other people don't control it. And all of this will later foster the idea of freedom of religion. John Locke will do a lot to promote this. And a lot of the argument is, look, you can't control a person's conscience. That's between them and God. If what matters is coming to church and doing the sacraments, you can compel that. But if what matters is the personal sort of relationship with God and your faith, the state can't kind of compel that. And all of this as well, lastly, also leads to the idea of separating religion from the material world. It contributes to this idea of the separation of the spiritual from the material and the secular. I'll come back to that again. Right? Religion is now immaterial, and that's different from my job, which is where I buy food, which is a non-religious thing. Okay, so that's what he does to religion. He makes it more interior and personal and helps lead to the basis of freedom of religion. So that was religion. Third is ordinary life. Luther, before the Reformation, is a very dedicated Catholic monk. He says he's the most dedicated Catholic monk he knows. And he's trying to be good because Luther is terrified with what in German is called Anfechtungen, and it means fear or doubt. And what he fears is burning in hell. And he finds no matter how hard he tries to be good, what he realizes even when he seems to do good is he's partly doing it because he wants to save himself for selfish reasons. And he's just terrified that he is, as he puts it, a worthless piece of dung. He doesn't use the word dung, I'm told. He uses the vernacular, if you will, that he's going to burn in hell. And all of this fear that had plagued him and terrified his life is solved one day. And this leads really to the break of the Reformation, is he reads one line in the Bible, in the letter of the Romans, where it says, the righteous shall live by faith. And this is where he realizes he has been thinking that he could live forever, go to heaven, by being a good person. But it's no, the righteous shall live by faith. And so Luther says we are saved by faith, not works. And as a result, he's been trying to be the best possible monk. He now thinks it was all a mistake. It's almost arrogant to think that you could be good enough to earn your way to heaven, because we're all worthless pieces of dung. We're just saved by faith. And so Luther will come to reject the monastic life, and he will attack it. Wretched, he says, is the spiritual estate of monks and nuns. All its works, conducts, and sufferings are unchristian, vain, and pernicious. At this point in time, the monks and nuns are the holy people of society, and he says, wretched are they. They cannot boast that what they do is pleasing in God's sight, as can a woman in childbirth. It's comparing a holy monk or a nun with a woman who's got, blood and fluid coming out of her body. And then he says, even if her child is born out of wedlock. Luther was a polemicist. He threw punches. And so what Luther does is he rejects the monastic life. He attacks it. And the monasteries and nunneries will partly just empty. And they don't totally empty, but they lose massive numbers of people. And in so doing, Luther redefines vocation. Vocation up to this point in time in Europe was, it meant that you took a holy life, that you became a priest, a monk, or a nun. And Luther says, no, now your vocation is, if you're a miller, be a Christian miller. If you're a farmer, be a Christian farmer. If you're a potter, do that in a Christian way. Treat your customers a certain way. Be a good Christian in your home. And what Luther does is he makes ordinary life sacred. And you and I are like this. If I ask you what is the ideal life, almost none of you, maybe none of you, would say it's to be a celibate Catholic monk. In 14 or 1500, many of us would have seen that as the ideal life. It was kind of socially the ideal life. Today, almost no one thinks that, even if you're a very good Catholic, right? What do we look at as the ideal life? Is it to become a philosopher like in ancient Greece? No. In Buddhism, it's still to become a monk. But what we look to is just ordinary life lived well. I think for most of you, if I asked you what is the ideal life, you would say, it's to have a job and thrive at your job, but to be loved by everybody. Your team loves you. Everybody just thinks you're a great person. And the guy, he also coaches his kids' hockey team. He's a great dad. He shovels a neighbor's driveway. He's on the board of the United Way, stuff like that. Or she, she runs a charity. She's executive director. Everyone loves working for her. When the neighbor gets sick, she's there with a casserole. She's all of that. That's what, if you have kids, that's what you hope for them, is to live ordinary life really well. And Luther does this. He sanctifies ordinary life. And in so doing, he rehabilitates sexuality. For 1,500 years, since the dawn of Christianity, the ideal had always been celibacy. It's true in the Catholic Church, true in the Orthodox Church, true in the Oriental Orthodox churches, like if you're familiar with the Coptics and the Eritrean Orthodox Church and things like that. Sexuality, even in Paul's letters, is a kind of concession. Paul sort of says, it's better to remain celibate, as I am, but if you burn with passion, okay, get married. It's okay, but it's not the best. And the Reformation, after 1,500 years of Christianity being pretty consistent that celibacy, lifelong celibacy was the best, the Reformation just pitches it out the window, creates a form of Christianity that doesn't think that way. And so Luther rehabilitates sexuality and sanctifies family life. Not to say no one had ever seen the family as holy, but in the Protestant tradition, it really will become the ideal. And this lays the ground one day for eventually, a couple of centuries later, for the rise of family values politics, right? Family values. When you hear Protestants talk about family values, or just in our society, when people talk about family values and their politicians, what they're saying is, if they're Christian, what they mean is the ideal Christian life is to get married and have children and stuff like that. They don't look at the ideal as being a celibate Christian. Back to our friend Michael Walzer, because he has something to say about ordinary life too. He says that with this aspect of reform in the Puritans, that it redefines things like family. He says that in the old idea of family, it was the patriarchal family. And in the patriarchal family, you have many kin. Sometimes you have household servants or apprentices and other hired workers, and they all live in the household, and they're all part of the family, essentially. But the new family, he says, is not like this. In the new family, it's really defined now by the conjugal unit, because you're not so tied to kin. Maybe you've not, you have, obviously you keep your relationships with your parents, but your loyalty now is to this ideological community, the Puritans or whatever. And so the family unit is the conjugal unit. And as a result, the Puritans make marriage into a secular contract, a voluntary arrangement. They're very big on agency. You choose to join the movement. So you must choose other important things like your marriage, rather than, say, it being arranged or something like that. It emphasizes greater intimacy in the marriage. Other factors matter too with this. There's a growth in urbanization and mobility. People are moving away from their family and their kin. There's capitalism and romanticism, which also emphasizes intimacy. But previously, when people lived in these larger patriarchal family networks, like my father lives next door and my brother's over there, you would find, if I'm a man, a lot of my intimacy was with that family. I'm married, but a lot of my intimacy is that I spend a lot of time with my brothers working, and my wife's, a lot of her intimacy is with her sisters-in-law in this particular example, or something like that. But when there's a conjugal unit starts to separate off, now the intimacy is to be your spouse. And so there's greater sort of standards for that. And eventually we'll get the idea of home as a haven in a kind of heartless world. You would not have thought that in this patriarchal family unit. You're all farming together and stuff. But eventually you go to work in town and you come home, and home is a place of intimacy. And again, this sort of sets the basis for what will become family values politics. And Walzer says that it also alters the notion of fatherhood. Puritans, he said, see the father really as the religious head of the household. In his household, he is everything. He is the prince, he is the schoolmaster of the household, the minister, and the judge. And his duties are to be done devoid of sentiment. He loves his family, but the way he serves them is to not let affection and softness corrode what needs to be done. And instead, he acts simply via a sense of duty. And so fatherhood was akin to a political office and a kind of calling, which granted the man, he says, something very near to sovereignty. The conjugal family, imitating the Puritan concept of household government, thus became, in effect, the local unit of the sovereign state. You remember reform? The way reform is going to work is you educate the men then rule their households, and in their households, they embed that reform in their children and in their wife and in that home. And so the father becomes an agent of reform. And you will see this affects modernity. You get this in American politics all the time, that family values politics is going out of style now in the Trump era. But when that was a big thing, and it sometimes still is, part of the idea was, we need Christian households that will teach Christian values. And that was the idea, is to create a whole society. Family values politics take seriously. That to reform the nation, you need to reform the household. If you want to have this kind of a nation, you have to go and shape the household. And so it politicizes the household. In 1400, kings didn't care what you're doing in your household. All they care about is, are you paying your taxes and, not causing trouble? But they didn't care about reforming you. But reform is different, and reform has to be interested in the family, and in so doing, restructures the family. Okay, so to sum up about ordinary life, the ideal now is ordinary life lived well, not to be a celibate monk. Work becomes a kind of calling, a vocation. Many of us look to our work to provide us meaning and not just income. Luther rehabilitates sexuality, as do the reformers generally. Celibacy as an ideal sort of dies away, and some of the shame around that will eventually ebb, and redefines the family really around the conjugal unit instead of around the extended patriarchal unit, which sets the groundwork for family values politics. Okay, that's ordinary life. So we talked about politics, religion, ordinary life. Let's now do the view of the person. Okay, a little water. Next. What we find with the Reformation is that individualism receives a very big boost. Some of this had actually become prior to the Reformation. People who studied Catholic penitentials, documents on how you do penance, noticed that there were changes in the sins that were given attention and in the penances that were therefore prescribed. So there was a new emphasis, for example, on sexual purity at the expense of sins of violence and anger. Violence and anger are social sins, but sexual purity is often about what do you desire inside your heart. So it emphasizes interiority again. And the penances shift from making restitution to those who had offended to reforming again the self. So some began sort of before the Reformation. And these piety movements really emphasized, there were a bunch of piety movements at the time of Luther and the decades before, emphasizing a personal commitment to God. But with the Reformation, it gets a major boost. And Luther here is going to provide that kind of boost because, as I mentioned to you earlier, he really emphasizes this idea of a priesthood of all believers, and he translates the Bible into the vernacular. So now you can read the words of God yourself and interpret them with no intermediaries. You don't rely on the priest. You don't rely on the church and stuff like that. You can do it yourself. And I already mentioned as well his emphasis on faith, which, as we recall, is located where? Inside the person, inside the individual. And so Luther, by de-emphasizing sacraments, de-emphasizing church hierarchy, and de-emphasizing sacred objects, and in its place emphasizes this kind of reading the Bible yourself and thinking about your relationship to God. The Puritans come along and they give this a boost by emphasizing agency. They're really into this idea of the freedom of the person, that you choose your marriage, you choose your church. They emphasize believers' baptism. Believers' baptism is that you don't baptize infants because they can't choose. You baptize them when they're 15 and have made a choice, or 20 or what have you. You choose your ideology, you choose your voluntary associations. And the Reformation will really give a boost to these three things: individualism, interiority, and agency. And these three things feed on one another. The more you emphasize the agency of the person, by nature, then they become more of an individual. They choose as an individual. Do I want a part of this group or that group? And as soon as it's therefore about my choosing, this prioritizes my interiority. What do I think about this? How do I feel about it? And the more I look to those feelings to guide me, the more it emphasizes that I'm an agent. I can choose what to do. And this is, in the West, we have this. In the winter, I'm going to be teaching about 4 traditions in East Asia, including, for example, Confucianism. Confucianism does not prioritize the individual like this. But in the West, it really is given a major boost by the Reformation. This is how we think of ourselves in the West. We think of as an individual who can choose, and we think of us as thinking people, right? Thinking agent, the chooser, essentially. And so as a result, the mind-centered view of the person really grows because of this emphasis on interiority. Previously, the self at the time of Luther was seen as penetrated by forces, and this continues even in Luther's life. Not everything shifts right away. You would see yourself as penetrated by things like demons and spirits. Witchcraft could sort of affect you. Physical matter could invade the self. If you have depression, the depression might be caused by a physical substance like black bile. All of this sort of de-emphasizes your agency. What can you do if you have black bile or you're controlled by a demon or something like that? But with the Reformation, there's a growing view of the person as a kind of buffered self. Now, we still know that we're affected by things, but now we often see that there's sort of a buffer between what happens to us and how we respond to it. We are ultimately, often we feel, in charge. And as I said, increasingly, meaning itself will become located within the mind. Increasingly, the depths of meaning in the cosmos are relocated in the psyche. In Luther's day, when Luther, the way he ends up joining the monastery, at least according to his account, is he's caught out one day in a thunderstorm, and he's terrified by the thunderstorm because the thunderstorms are like demons coming to get you, the lightning. He's terrified. And he prays to God and says, if you get me through this, I'll become a monk. Right? That universe is full of meaning. There are demons everywhere and spirits and angels helping you. It's a sacred sort of order. We don't look at the world that way anymore, right? But where do we find meaning? With this emphasis on the individual and interiority, we find it in the psyche. Now people have you sit down on a couch and say, tell me about your childhood. Tell me about your mother. This would have made no sense in 1500. Okay, so we get this the view of the person changes to one that emphasizes far more the individual and this idea of a buffered self, that there is a kind of barrier between you and the world. Okay, so that's a view of the person. And 5th is the mystery one. At Luther's time, there are places of spiritual power. You can still go see this. This is St. Sylvan the Martyr in Croatia. He died in the 4th century, and his body is not decaying, so you can make pilgrimages there. If you made a pilgrimage there, you were in a place of spiritual power, and maybe it would be like contagious. Maybe it would like help heal you. There were objects of spiritual power. I already told you about some of these, right? People would go to be in the presence of these objects or to touch them. And there were others, crown of thorns, all sorts of things. There were times of spiritual power. There was a sacred calendar, and it was so-and-so's feast day. And on so-and-so's feast day, that saint was particularly accessible to you. And if you prayed to him, he would help to intercede on God's behalf, and good things would happen to you. The Reformation gets rid of all of this. It doesn't like the physical objects. I've mentioned to you about that. It doesn't like these places of spiritual power. I told you it gets rid of the statues. It doesn't like the feast days. And what the Reformation does is it secularizes. I didn't want to say that. What it does is it homogenizes time and space. All time is the same. All space is the same. And what do you call that when time is homogeneous and space is homogeneous? I gave away the answer. It's secularism. A lot of scholars say that the Protestant Reformation leads to what famous sociologists call the disenchantment of the world. Luther lived in an enchanted world. There were demons, there were angels, there was witchcraft. Not many of you see the world that way anymore. It's ordinary. It's governed by physical laws and things like that. What do you call that? That is a secular world. Did any of the reformers want to create a secular world? No, they don't know it. But There's a number of scholars who see secularism as sort of an offshoot, if you will, of Protestantism. And as well with the disenchantment of the world is a kind of a more secular self, because as we were just describing a moment ago, the self is buffered. The self isn't so permeated by demons and by witchcraft, and you're not controlled by black bile. And when you get all that that sort of magical element out of the self, you get a self who's ordinary, who's secular. Okay, and so that is the fifth thing the Reformation shaped, was the birth of secularism. Okay, so just to review, how did the Reformation shape politics? Well, you remember, we talked about how it sows the seeds unwittingly for constitutionalism, for democracy, and of course, for reform. We've also seen how it has reshaped religion, how it emphasized an idea of religion that is more individual, that's more interior. It's about a belief. It's a private thing inside of your heart. And that privatization of religion also means it's easier to create certain defense of the separation of church and state and the freedom of religion. Third, a reshaping of ordinary life. Now we see the best life as the ideal is ordinary life lived well. We get a rehabilitation of sexuality, and we sometimes see work as a kind of vocation. Fourth, a different view of the person, more individual. We emphasize our agency and our interiority and a buffered self, that there's a buffer between us and the world. And fifth, we see the creation of secularism, a secular homogeneous world and a secular self. Okay, I finished this faster than usual. I'm not sure why. I thought I was not going overly fast. Just before I go to questions, I wanted to mention a couple of things to you. If you're interested, I am going to be teaching a 4-part series in January and February on East Asian religions. We'll start with Confucianism, which is the most influential system in all of East Asia. Then we'll go to Buddhism, Taoism, and Shinto. And I'm going to be talking not just about the religions, but how much they permeate and shape East Asian culture, sort of like today's class, actually, in some respects. And so if you're interested in that, you can sign up. It's 4 Thursdays. I think it's $80, and you can sign up at worldreligions.ca. And if you're really up for something keen, the highlight of my year every year is we run a Discovery Week in July. This year will be July 7th to 13th. And what we do in 1 week in Toronto, it's close to Center Place. It's a few blocks away. We explore the world's religions in 1 crazy week. Well, we explore 11 religions. I will teach introductory classes to all 11 religions. And we have somewhere close to 20 site visits. We go to spectacular Hindu temples. We go to the Sikh Gurdwara. And because I have you at night, because I have you all week, I take you to the Gurdwara in the evening. I want you to watch the Sikhs carry their scripture book to bed. We go to the Hindu Arti. We go to a mosque, but we don't just go to the mosque. We go Friday at midday. We have a meal with the imam, and we go at midday and Friday because to understand Islam, I will teach a class. I want you to understand about the Prophet Muhammad and about Sharia and about Sunni and Shia. But part of Islam is to feel a packed mosque at prayer. Part of the idea of the week is that religions aren't just ideas, that they have emotions. And there's a feel to a Hindu temple with bells going and a bare-chested priest chanting Sanskrit and pouring milk over a statue. And there's a pile of bananas and incense in the air. And it feels very different at a mosque. It is, as I say, it's a highlight of my year. I love doing it. If any of you would love to come or are interested in coming, I hope you go check it out again at worldreligions.ca. We've been doing it for 20 years, and people come back 10 years later with their grown kid, and they often tell us it's the best thing that they've done. I didn't dream it up, so I claim no credit in highlighting it. Okay, folks. So if you're interested in that, that's the Discovery Week. Okay, and with that, let me stop sharing my screen here, and we'll go to questions.
Thank you so much, Brian, for this amazing presentation. And now I did send you some questions on our chat so that I can continue to take notes here. So we have a few questions. Just let me know if you've seen them.
Yeah, okay. So let's see here. Josh asked, do you agree with historian Tom Holland that Salafism is a Protestantization of Islamic theology? I haven't heard Holland's argument, so it's a little hard for me to respond to that. I can see some of the argument of it. It certainly, and sorry, the Salafis are a modern Islamic reform movement that is tries to go back to the, it's looking backward to the golden age, and it is also got a zealousness to it, sort of like reform, I guess you could say. I think there is a similarity, certainly in like, the Salafis often, for example, don't like physical things. Like they don't like the Sufi shrines and things like that. And I think it is very textual. A lot of what's happened with Protestantism, a lot of the Protestant shift in Christianity is actually happening in a lot of religions. So I can see sense to it, but I haven't heard the details of his argument. There's another question here, I think from Leon. Did any aspects of the Reformation sneak their ways into the Roman Catholic structure? Oh, very good question, Leon. So slowly. The first impact of the Reformation on the Catholic Church is the Church within a couple of decades launches the Counter-Reformation. And the big impact of the Counter-Reformation was the Church rejected almost every doctrinal thing that Luther or the Reformers had put forward. But what the Church does is it cleans up its act. It had grown lax and kind of, a fat cat, if I can use such a crass term. But many Catholics look back and say, yeah, it wasn't good. So the first thing they do is clean up their act. They do, like, another thing that you can see fairly early on is they launch the Jesuits, and the Jesuits are really into education. So you do get this turn towards education, for example. But a lot of other things take a lot longer. The Catholic Church doesn't reconcile itself to secularism really until sort of Vatican II and freedom of religion and stuff. It really wants more of an entirely Catholic society. But today, Catholics are, I think, have been affected by the Reformation as well, see themselves more as individuals. Most Catholics don't look at it as a monk or a nun as the ideal life, but that didn't happen in the 1500s. That took a lot longer. So it's over time, the Protestant Reformation has continued, I think, to shape the West. Next question. Do you share Weber's view that capitalism has a Protestant origin or character? Yeah, so Weber wrote a famous essay or a book called, I just lost it, The Spirit of Capitalism. The Protestant Work Ethic, The Spirit of Capitalism. He basically, if you've heard the term Protestant work ethic, it sort of comes from him. I read it a long time ago, and I remember at the time there were critiques of it, but I think a lot of people think there is some value to it. That Weber's argument, for those who aren't familiar with it, he said that the Puritans, for example, in particular, that they had the this idea that I don't want to go into all the details of it. I think some elements of his argument have not held up so well. He emphasized too much how predestination leads to this idea, but I think what you get is you do get a kind of Protestant work ethic, and I think there's some. I think people who've critiqued his theory think that there's some sense to that. Sorry, that was kind of a jumbled answer. Did the eclipse of the Caliphate as a central religious and political authority, like the Catholic and Orthodox churches, have any similar effects on Islamic societies? No. Very good question. I would say no. So the Caliphate was kind of, the closest thing to the equivalent of a pope, essentially, in Islam for a long time. And did the end of it have a similar effect on Islamic societies? I think the big thing is that the caliph never has quite the authority of the pope. The caliph is the leader of the society, for example, the Ottoman Turk, but he doesn't have the overwhelming authority of the pope. He's not infallible, for example. He would turn to, he's not even a religious figure. He's a political one who's also a religious figure. So I don't think it's ever as, it doesn't have the same gravitas. It doesn't reorient your world in the same way. Daryl says, John has mentioned that he views atheism as basically a form of Protestantism. There you go. What do I think about this idea? Yeah, so that's very much what I was talking about, is that secularism is seen as a kind of offshoot of Protestantism. And, another word for someone who's completely secular is to say atheism. I do want to say there have always been atheists before there was a Protestant Reformation. You can encounter them anywhere in history, but it has become a much more, today you can go to Denmark and maybe half the people in the country are atheists. And that is uncommon, and that is because it is the most secular country. So yeah, I definitely think Protestantism fosters atheism in a way that doesn't have. We never seen anything like that before. John, with the presence of Jesus in the host, with the present, Catholics believe in transubstantiation. Would we have to admit that the Bible, as we know it, was actually formed by the Catholic Church? Is that correct? Oh, I see. Kind of. The Bible as we know it, like when it's being formed, the Catholic Church itself is kind of being formed. It's a co-forming of the two things, if you will. That is just complicated because, so for example, even by probably the year 150, the four Gospels definitely have a status that is beyond any other than the other Gospels. There are a lot of other Gospels written. So some of that is there very early. But in the 4th century, when the Bible is solidified, it is the first time that the church is sort of meeting in these kind of councils. And so those councils are deciding orthodoxy and the Bible at the same time. So I think there's kind of a co-evolution between the two. Ruth, I'm interested in the Asian religion discussion, but I know several of the days I can't attend live. Is it available later on record? Yes, we will record them. So if you sign up, then the one you miss, if you miss one or two, you can catch them on recording. Thanks, Ruth. It'd be lovely to have you. Okay. I think those are all the questions, unless there's any other, Leandro.
I think that's all we have. I get to go home early. Yay. I do have a question. Brian, can you show us what you have in your office? Because I love your office, Brian.
Oh, yeah.
Turn my cam off so that you can get the big picture
there.
Sure.
I think I can lift this thing up here and move it around. Yes, okay. So so I work at a World Religion Center, as I've told you. So my office is filled with artifacts. My predecessor, the guy who created that Discovery Week I told you about, he collected things. So you can see there's some Hindu objects over there. Right behind my desk is a kind of Buddhist setup there with the Buddha, some smaller Buddhas. There's a prayer wheel on the table, and that is a tonk. That is a Tibetan Buddhist tapestry. If we go over here more, there's some Islamic things in that corner. You can see the calligraphy. There's a Jain object. And over here, sorry, I'm trying to watch this. This whole table is Wiccan objects. There's Wiccan ritual items. You can see the besom or the broom. So there's some more things there. As we go along here, there's a whole sort of shelf of very large Hindu and Buddhist objects, including the Shiva Lingam, that stone thing beside the red Buddha. If I took you higher up on the wall, there's a lot of Christian iconography. There's, again, some Buddhist and some Hindu items. And then in the corner is about Ganesh. If you're familiar with the Hindu god Ganesh, the entire corner from top to bottom, there's a Hindu temple shrine. There's several Ganeshas inside it.
Speak to the microphone, Brian.
Oh, sorry. That corner there is all about Ganesh. You can see Ganesh is on every level. There's a thin Ganesh at the top. He's an ascetic who has lost weight, and that temple is filled with Ganeshas. And along the bottom here, there's some Shinto, a Shinto shrine, for example. There is a talking stick that was given by an indigenous elder. There's Ganesh again. There's a lot of Jewish items. See the menorah, and there's a Torah cover and a shofar. We have a few shofars. There's some Zoroastrian things beside the shofar and beside the Jewish items. And up top, there's some Rasta items, images of Haile Selassie, and again, some more First Nations things. Okay, we're almost done here. If we come to this side of the room, There is some ancient Egyptian things, a lot of Sikh items. There's a Chinese Jesus there in the corner I really like. And maybe I'll end here. This is a tapestry, and it has the opening phrase of the Tao Te Ching, which is a famous phrase. It says, the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. It's one of the most famous lines in scripture. So there you go. Okay, sorry that I was shaking. My hands are never very stable. I hope I didn't give any of you like.
Thank you for the tour, Brian.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, we do have a couple more questions, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Okay, I have Leon asks what the topic of your PhD is.
Oh, thanks, Leon. My PhD was on evangelicals in Canada. So it was religion and politics. And it's a funny thing. Like I started off to examine evangelicals, but I ended up examining secularism as well. So I was looking at, can a secular society accommodate conservative religiosity? Like, does it work? And I mostly concluded not very well, that the two are naturally in some tension with them. And that while secularism aims to be fair to religion at some level, it really can't aim to be fair to conservative religiosity because there's some fundamental problems. So I found it really interesting. It went very well. I was told by several people that there's a book there, but I'm too busy at my day job. I will probably never publish that book. Thank you for asking. I really enjoyed my dissertation. The process was hell, but I enjoyed my dissertation in another way.
And our friend, Objective Ethics, wants to know if you would come back and do a lecture on Zoroastrianism.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I could do that. Yeah. The Zoroastrians are fun.
Okay, last question. Yeah, go ahead.
If you come to Discovery Week, we not only get the lecture on the Zoroastrians, we go visit the Zoroastrians.
Excellent. Last question. What are you eating tonight?
What am I eating tonight? I already ate. I had pasta.
Okay, pasta. Oh yeah, see, someone else is having pasta tonight. Huh? Great. All right, I'll be there in a sec. All right. Thanks, Brian, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Happy Thanksgiving to our friends in the United States, and see you next week. John's going to be back here at Center Place for our next lecture. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, everybody.